China has a rising inequality in both all the dimensions, rising income inequality, social inequality. And there, as Scott pointed out, it seems there are many low-hanging fruit options for interventions. But why the government are not doing it? Why the local government don't respond to it? It seems so obvious. And then the question comes is, we need to understand political economy of public provisions and also need to understand incentives local officials. This is why the first paper comes in to understand the role of decentralization the contribution of decentralization on a rural-urban income gap. I think the paper has made a contribution in this regard. Dali has offered some background information, so I would like to first provide more institutional background to help you understand the main findings of the result. So one key feature of the Chinese system is the economically speaking, China has a very decentralized system. But politically speaking, China is a very centralized system. I think in Chinese we have a yin-yang, it's always balanced. You cannot be both centralized and also both decentralized. During the planned economic era, China has both centralized economic system and centralized political system. And then observe the problem because the central government had a big information problem, a local government didn't have incentive, and then we saw stagnations. This is why in the last 30 years, the major reform at least on the economic front to decentralize the system, to empower people and empower local government. India is on the other side of the system. It's more like a mirror. India has a very centralized economic system, but the decentralized decentralized political system. But you see very few countries with both decentralized systems. Why? Because the rich regions may want to go to independent if they both have political power and the fiscal power. They don't want to share the fiscal cost with the poor neighbors. Sorry. I'm really sorry. So the political system China is, I would say that is replicate vertical hierarchical structure. It's like a top-down approach. The reason is because the central government needs to make sure the central mandate can be carried down to all the way to the local level. There are many central mandates in China, like family planning policies, social stability, and like occupational safety. They make sure no major accidents, no social unrest. So if you look at the graph, you can see the system. You look at the central level, there are so many different ministries. You go to the provincial level, you see exactly the same number of ministries mapping up to the central government. If you go all the way to the township, you find almost exact institutional settings corresponding to the central government. When I was doing a survey in Gansu province a few years ago, one of the first county, I found it even has sports administration bureaus. I think in such a poor county, I don't know how many athletes has ever been trained. The reason there's a sports bureau because this corresponding to the central government. These people just sitting there have nothing to do. So this is the Chinese system because they have to make sure all the mandates can be carried down. And the setting up of the bureaucracy is totally proportional to the total hukou population. So if you plot the total number government size and the total population, you see almost all follow the 45-degree line. There's a 编制, the start called the office. So the government size is really controlled, mainly based on the population on the hukou. But this causes a problem because we know the initial endowment is very different. Some regions are quite rich to start with, but relative to their government size, maybe there are more fiscal revenues to support the small government size. And then you see a relatively small government in the rich regions. But in the poor regions, I'm really sorry. And then you see the problem, the fiscal burdens. In the more developed regions, you see the fiscal burden is much higher, but it's lower. But in the poor regions, the fiscal burden is higher, the relatively speaking. And this caused a regressive tax rate. In the rich regions, the tax rate is relatively low, although the nominal rate is exactly the same. But the local tax collectors already have some discretionary power to collect taxes. But in the poor regions, you see the effective tax rate is much higher. So I just give you a story. In the poor regions, in Gansu Township, you hardly see any industries, usually a few shops. When I talk to the local officials, they're usually bragging, "Oh, this shop, my wife is operating the shops." Usually, the only way to survive is to have some political connections, and then other officials want to go there to extort from them. If you have a factory, there are so many officials there. If you go there, always want to get free meals and get bribes. So the surviving environment, operational environment is very harsh in the poor regions because this hidden cost. In contrast, in the rich regions, usually you see the cluster-based model. There are thousands of factories, but the number of tax collectors is the same as the poor regions. So for each tax collector, even he's equally corrupted, the chance to intervene a factory is very small. So for each factory, actually the tax burden, the chance of being extorted is very, very small. So that's why in the poor regions, you see a very enabling environment. And then they attract more capital away from the poor regions because the entrepreneurs, they don't have chance to survive in the poor regions. So they migrate to cities, to the coast areas to make investment there. So you cause the capital flow from poor area to rich areas. So this widen the regional inequality. So they cause the two spirals. So the poor regions, they have very small tax base, very limited revenues because the government has abolished agricultural taxations. There are almost no tax basis. The only way to survive is to look up, to try to get tax the transfer from the central government. So what they do best is to do whatever they can to keep the poverty hat. If you talk to poverty secretaries in the poverty counties, their most important job is to lobby the central government to keep the transfers, to keep the poverty status, because this is a major revenue stream for them. But in the rich regions, because the share of central revenues transfer is so small, they don't care. And then the main attention is to help the firms. So if you are a field researcher, you will see the pattern very clearly. If you go to poor regions, the local officials only want to go banquet with you for even 3 meals because they assume you are from Beijing, you may have some connections. But if you go to Zhejiang, I never get treated meals by township leaders. So you can see there are different attitudes, there are two equilibrium. So this is why there's a regional disparity, increasing regional disparity. I already talked about that. Because of this reason, if you plot the measures of decentralization and regional inequality, you see in general over the past 60 years, there's a co-movement between decentralization and the regional inequality. Now I'll go back to this paper. I want to check whether the findings are valid or not. So I take the results from the first 2 tables. I only want to first plot the lines to see at least whether there are any correlations between the 2 lines, like the tax sharing rate and the rural-urban income ratio. You see the correlation is rather weak. But that's the central theme of your paper. I want to show that tax sharing rate is cause the rural-urban income inequality. But this, at least from the figures, we don't see an obvious correlation. We all know the rural gap is formed mainly because the hukou system. How hukou system came about is because in the 50s, China had a heavy industry led development strategy. because China is copying the Soviet model. In order to do that, they have to extract as much resources, revenues from the agriculture sector to subsidize the industry sector. And then this is why the Hukou was created, to prevent people moving from rural area to the industry sector. I think this is the major reason for the rural-urban gap. So if you look at the two lines, the heavy industry development strategy measures, that's the share of heavy industry output in total output, explain the rural gap quite well until the reform period, like the late early 90s. But these early 90s, China has abolished the rural heavy industry-led development strategies, so the two lines start set apart. Now come to the paper. I have a question on the measuring of the rural-urban gap. Because right now you use, in each prefecture city, you use the average rural income, rural-urban income to rural income as a measure. But when you present in the beginning, you frame the question at the national level. It's national rural-urban inequality. But I would want to say that rural-urban inequality at the local level is totally different from overall inequality at the national level, because it didn't take into account the cross-regional migrations, and also didn't take into account the within rural and within urban inequality at the prefecture level. Let me give you a show with a very simple graph. Suppose the country has two regions, inland and coast. So in each region, you have like 4 individuals, 2 rural, 2 urban. One rural is poor, a little bit rich, not is rich. Urban 2 also have 1 poor, 1 rich. Similar in the coast area. We assume all the coast population are richer than the inland population. Now you move, suppose there are some transfer policies, you move some people away. Under the transfer policy, some people get better education, they move out to coastal area. Suppose the rich poor move to the coast area to work in the factories. And you see this line, this distribution. Clearly in the inland area, the rural-urban gap has increased because there drop in the rich poor. In the coast areas, also you see increasing rural-urban gap. For the China as whole, you see a reduction in rural-urban gap, also increase in total national income. So I think I suggest use another method, the so-called regression-based decomposition method. The first round regressions for the whole sample. Each prefecture have 1 rural, 1 urban. You have all the determinants like tax rate, etc. After round regressions, you can apply the Sherrock's inequality decomposition method. You can quantify the contributions like fiscal revenue sharing to overall rural-urban inequality. I think that's the best way to explain the overall national rural-urban inequality. And also I have a question on mapping findings to policy options. You said it's necessary, one last slide. It's necessary to introduce local accountability from the bottom up through both democracy elections and information transparency. But the election is just one way to hold the local officials accountable. You can find a counter-examples like India's case. The public services like schools are very bad, even worse than in China, although it has better so-called local accountability. There are many, right now in China there are many reforms going on. They're all quite indigenous, but try to deal with the problem of the institutions. One way is to cut government size. There are some experiments in Hubei province to cut the professional level government. You shrink the government size, reduce the tax burdens to local people. And also there, in poor areas, there's a movement to merge townships, also try to reduce government size. And also there are some programs to borrow police officers from poor regions to rich regions. Because in the poor areas, all the migrant workers have gone to coast areas. There are no crimes. The police officers have nothing to do. But in the coast areas, there are sort of police officers. Recently, there's experience, the Ministry of Public Security has a meeting, they promote this kind of experience. So this kind of exchange of study contents can somehow alleviate the problem. And also recently there's a pairwise aid strategy. After the earthquake, the South government realized it cannot transfer aid to the disaster region very quickly because information problem. And then they came up with a very ingenious idea to pairwise the rich coastal province with the disaster country, immediately solve the information problem. And then they apply this strategy to develop the western region, like Xinjiang example. So ask coast areas, one coast area to have one county in Xinjiang province, one by one. And then immediately create a lot of positive impact because some officials in coast area are rotated to Xinjiang. They have a lot of experience to help local economy, so they can bring this expertise to change the mindset there. So there are many innovations. Let me stop there so you can see I can email the slide. You can see other suggestions.
Thank you very much.
I have to apologize to the speakers because you have a rather inadequate discussant. This is not an area I'm rather new to this area. I don't know a lot about it, but you're actually getting a lot of me indirectly because the last discussant clearly had a lot to say. Was in some sense a student of mine, and he learned everything from me. You were in a class of mine for what? 1 day, right? Before you dropped it, but it must have been a really good day. And now, of course, the teacher, or Erzat's teacher, is learning from the students. All right. So first, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading this paper. I learned a lot from it. In particular, the institutional detail was fascinating. This is a really complicated problem, and I was glad to have a chance to think about it. All right. So basically, the question is. That the paper asks is, can China's revenue centralization and expenditure decentralization scheme reduce urban, rural, and interregional inequality? And if you think about fiscal federalism from a mechanism design point of view, you might think that this is an obvious yes. Okay, and that was certainly my thought when I actually. After I read the introduction to the paper, I said, oh, well, this is what the answer has to be. And then we see some empirical work here that tells us that's not the case and gives us a rather convincing story for why that's not the case. So the question is why not? And the second part of the paper answers this, namely that the allocation of local government revenues is not directed appropriately to poverty alleviation problems, and that I think was an interesting thing to learn. And I'm going to talk mostly about the first part of the paper rather than the second. So there's something that has been puzzling me. I want to just begin with some general comments about inequality and growth. There's something that's been puzzling me because all day today we've been looking. We have seen pictures like this a number of times, and here's how it works. And here we have the big run up right there. You kind of do this. In income inequality, but you'll notice that things actually begin to flatten out a little bit, and then even in recent years, although it's too early to make much of this, there begins to be a bit of decline. So there seems to be some kind of change of regime going on. Here's another paper of a picture from another paper where the vertical axis is measuring a coefficient of variation in incomes and plotting them out through time. And again, we see the same kind of thing. And so a question that I'd like to know the answer to is what's going on from here on out, right? And it is a little bit puzzling, I think, that on the one hand, what we learned from this paper is that the program that we're seeing really doesn't work, okay? And yet, on the other hand, there is a little bit of this flattening out that is beginning to happen, and that's something I think that is worth some investigation. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more generally about the relationship between inequality and growth and other issues, and why we actually care about this question at all. So let me start off with the sources of inequality. There are several that are, I should look at my notes here, several that are suggested in the literature. A very old argument is due to Kuznets that basically says when an economy begins to take off, it doesn't take off evenly, and therefore those people associated with the sectors that are in fact moving are going to benefit relative to those that don't, and then the expectation is, you know, that over time as the economy matures, these things will even out. That's the old Kuznets argument. Another argument that we often find is the market barrier argument. And there are two of them. Stephen referred to one of them in his comments earlier, namely that this is an idea that I think we attribute to Glenn Lowry, right? That unequal access to capital markets creates barriers to human capital investment for poor families. And when Glenn was writing about that, he thought about that in terms of education. But I suppose that exactly that same argument goes and applies to things like health, prenatal care, so on and so forth. So it's actually a richer argument even than Glenn originally thought when he put it forth. A second source of inequality are market barriers. This is something actually that, and I want to talk. I'm sorry. A second source is barriers to migration. This is something that Ming Li mentioned in her conclusion. The Hukou system is very interesting. There's a paper by John Wally and Chunming Zhang that calibrates. It's a GE model, and it calibrates the effect of removal of the Hukou system and makes the claim that well, they actually say that most regional inequality will go away. I don't find that exactly credible, but they do make the claim that it is. I do find credible the claim that there would be a sizable reduction of inequality. So it does seem that this is a very costly thing. There are several other papers that have made this point more recently. A third source of inequality has to do with political economy in one particular way. And I'm now thinking about the Japanese experience, namely that the government pushes certain sectors at the expense of others. And so this is kind of the government push version of the Kuznets argument, that those associated with the sectors that the government likes are going to do well. This creates enormous rent-seeking opportunities above and beyond its immediate consequences for inequality, and there are other kinds of political economy stories that go on. The last thing I've mentioned is institutions, and I've learned from Daronin Asimoglu that institutions explain everything. But moving beyond. Didn't you say it explains quantum mechanics? So. Or maybe it's the deeper meaning of quantum mechanics. So, a particular thing I find very interesting, because I'm interested in social capital and social networks, and this is an argument that I do find credible, is that as a you know, in an underdeveloped economy, an economy that's missing lots of markets. Social institutions and formal social institutions arise and take the place of markets, right? And we have all kinds of tales that you can read throughout the development literature, right? About a variety of risk sharing and income and forced saving schemes and so on and so forth. A lot has been written about that. And those are on the one hand, you know, they basically work off of reciprocity, and so they need to be small in scale. And I have 5 minutes, okay. And so what happens as an economy grows and market institutions begin to develop, and institutions become formalized, right? Then individuals who have access to those market institutions have access to a much broader array of resources. Now you have the generalized trust replacing particularized trust, and so on and so forth. So those people who have, and then you have formal enforcement of property rights, et cetera, et cetera. So those people who have access to the market society have a big advantage. Okay. What about the consequences of inequality? Well, we spent part of the morning, talking about distributive justice consequences of this. So I'm not going to talk about those at all. And all of this stuff I've labeled as what we think. That was true for the sources as well. There are a variety of I'm actually not going to take the time to really expand on this, there are highly unequal societies create incentives for individuals to engage in criminal activities, stuff like this. We've talked about this. Social political instability discourages accumulation of capital because of current disruptions and future uncertainty. There's no point investing if you don't think that you're going to actually have the property right in that many more years' time. A lot of stories, Alessina and Perotti is a paper that we associate with this, many more. There are other arguments having to do with the consequences of this. There are market failures not remedied by transfers or credit constraint stories due to Galorzera, Agion, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we all think happens. Okay, so now the question is what really happens. And the fact is that there are no systematically established facts about the relationship between inequality and growth. Right thing. Let's see, so there are a number of papers, Alessina and Roderick, so on and so forth. They find a negative relationship. Barrow, Lopez, they find no relationship. Li and Zhao, they find, and Kristen Forbes, they find a positive relationship. And then just to split the difference between the three of them, Banerjee and Duflo say it's an inverted U. Okay? I guess what we don't have is the real U. That's the only thing that's missing. Okay? And no doubt that paper's coming down the pike. So the question is, why is this actually true? Well, one possibility is that there's no systematic relationship at all. I don't find that plausible. I don't think anybody in the room does. Another possibility is that the models that they're using to estimate these things, or maybe the whole methodology of cross-country growth regressions is bad. I find that actually somewhat plausible. And then related to that is the idea that there is a systematic relationship in each, but it really does depend upon the details of each country, and each country is in some sense unique, having to do with culture, political culture, social culture, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're not going to untangle these things through cross-country growth regressions. And those are the two things that I find plausible. So, and I think that thinking about that last point is very important because it seems to me that we can't really get at these kinds of questions by doing an aggregative analysis. Okay, that we really need to get into micro-founded studies of the sources of inequalities and the effectiveness of inequality remediation policies. All right, and that's an issue, I think, for this paper because I think that at the scale, now I'm just echoing something that Xiaobo said, that at the scale at which we're talking about, doing cross-regional studies in China is a lot like doing cross-country studies in Latin America, right? The scale is more or less the same. And all right, so again, for lack of time, I'm not going to elaborate on that, although I would love to do so. Let me turn to the model. I'm kind of Dolofian this way. Let me turn to the model, and the model actually has two parts. Part number one, equation number one, is a budget constraint, the government's budget constraint, and then there is a behavioral relationship, which is this one down here, the change in log inequalities, this linear thing. And then the authors take us down to the bottom equation here, and they derive this by assuming one of the. So this is actually a question that I didn't understand, and maybe one of you can explain this to me. In order to get from here to here, I had to assume that there was no change in the. Better change the right thing here. That there was actually no change in the total revenues of the government as a result of the policy. And I wondered why that would be true. Okay, and this is actually the beginning. My time is now out. Okay, so I'm going to stop in 1 second. This is what we all do. So I had a number of other questions like this, like what's going on with the. Why would it be the case that the tax rate, the sharing rate at I-1 would not be correlated in some way with epsilon, the same way it's true with R, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I got stuck when I read this part of the paper. I didn't know how to go forward because I found myself trying to think of all these special cases, and then I realized that Well, I'm really doing the author's work here, because what I'm trying to do in my head is to develop the micro model, right? Maybe the political economy model or so on and so forth, that would allow me to really assess the quality of the instrument and and make some causal claims out of this. So at the end, basically my request to the authors is please unpack the model a bit, right? Tell us why this is the right equation. Why in particular is this a stable relationship that over the course, right, of the time period in which you're doing this. I have a number of other comments, but I think I will stop here. I realize at this point, okay, that I'm the only thing that is standing between you here, and on the other hand, the closing remarks and the alumni reception. So I do have some, a couple of, well, actually, let me make one more point. The one more point simply has to do with the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the big thing that we all see, but we don't acknowledge. And one of the things that is puzzling me, by the way, this is you can't see this because this is on my slide. This is a picture from yesterday's New York Times. And yesterday's New York Times had an article about forced migration in China, and pointed out that, and I don't know whether this is entirely correct, you can't trust the Times anymore, but is it the case, right, that the Chinese government is in fact kind of doing a experiment of kind of randomizing over villages and bulldozing them and moving people to the city, right? And the way that migration basically entered your model, right, that is an additive term at the end. But I cannot see why the relationship that we're estimating would be stable under the kinds of migrations going on at the scale at which the government would like to accomplish. And consequently, even if if I'm happy with the model as it stands, I nonetheless don't believe that it's going to be very useful for this kind of counterfactual exploration of what might happen over the next 5 or 10 years, because it just seems to me unlikely that these relationships are going to remain stable. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about this. This was a very stimulating paper.
Decentralization is not working, and it does not work because of serious lack of local accountability, and actually I need to go back to check the formulas, but I don't think it hurts. We can just add using we have to assume if log P to be 0. You can add one regresses there, let me find out. And also I want to, so the key idea of this paper is to say that we do see a lot of post-elevation in China. That's actually is more or less driven by the huge scale migration. Even though there's still fiscal reform, but you see a lot of 200 million temporary migrant workers. They're already working in cities. For a long time, they make good money, and they come from poor area. But the central government is also trying to, pour a lot of resources in these poor countries. It may not work, and it seems to us it will work very well. So we're proposing a market-based, poverty elevation. The government, of course, have some role to play, and then do it in the cities. Don't go to this poor area where there's not much, potential for development anyway. There's big bureaucracy that needs, all these resources for public employment and private and dinner parties. So that's actually what we're, but I also want to respond to Xiaobo's question. Actually, I don't agree with you that China is a highly decentralized economic system. China's expenditure is highly decentralized, but revenue is very centralized. This is what this paper is showing. That then the government want to centralize revenue and then give it to poor area. So this is what we call transfer-based decentralization. This system, this money will not work. That's actually the main argument of. We show in our paper it will not work. Because lack of accountability. The government wants to, mainly cares about itself. Particularly in less developed regions, if you see how much they spend, in in hiring more public employees, and also restrictive expenses. You may not be surprised. I would stop here.
Could let me add because I do want to address both. I want to thank the two commentators, but especially I think Xiaobo is making the point that we commit ecological fallacy in making this particular argument. But we need to think more seriously about this afterwards. But I do think actually, based on all we know, much of the inequality in China is driven by urban-rural inequality. So if we can demonstrate that, in fact, whatever the government does actually can significantly affect inequality, especially urban-rural, in these different cities, I think we make an interesting contribution to this particular literature in terms of trying to actually understand how it happens in the region. That doesn't get us away entirely from the ecological fallacy problem, but I think we do make actually, I think in this particular sense, to the extent that we can address the issue of rising urban-rural inequality, we actually get fairly close to dealing with the issue. But I agree, though, that we do need to think a little more carefully about this particular issue later on.